into the parking lot, and Rachel said, "Wow, the parking lot's really full." I said, "Don't say that." But glad each one of you are here this morning. I'm glad to be here. Got a good message for you, I hope. But I hope you don't mind. I'm going to jump right into the message this morning because we have a lot of ground to cover. We're talking about David and Bathsheba this morning. And I didn't realize how big of a story this is. I had to leave several pages of notes out of my message because it didn't all fit into one Sunday. So you're going to get kind of the flyover of what I thought was the most important things to cover here. As you can see by the cover slide, which is not up there yet, we're going to be talking about David and Bathsheba, and there's going to be some things in here this morning that may not be real suitable for kids. It's nothing crazy over the top, but there will be some conversations that if you don't want young kids to hear that, you may want to move them downstairs. But this morning, because it's the story of David and Bathsheba, and you look at the way our culture operates, this story this morning is going to be directed mainly to the men in the church. Of course, this subject matter can go both ways, but you'll see kind of the way I laid this out. It's directed mainly to the men, and so I just pray that the wives would be there to support their husbands through this subject matter, but that's the way I've laid it out this morning. So this is a heavy message. This is a heavy story. It's a heavy subject that infiltrates our culture in many different ways, and so that's where we're at this morning. So you may be wondering, why on earth, Eric, when you're the fill-in preacher, why would you pick such a heavy subject matter to cover? Well, this subject kind of makes people squeamish in their seats sometimes. They don't want to talk about it because this is one of the topics that you're not supposed to talk about in church and you're not supposed to talk about around the dinner table is this matter of sexuality and sexual infidelity. So that is actually the exact reason that I decided to talk about it. I have never been one to shy away from hard discussions in any setting that I'm placed in, and I believe that this discussion should be had in our churches. And plus, I volunteered to do this, so you can't even fire me. So, anyway, the real reason I want to talk about this, to be a little bit more honest and a little more open, I have a little bit more personal situation going on where I have a friend of mine that was just in a recent David-Bathsheba situation, and unfortunately, he took David's route, and he failed in that temptation that he had. And as I watch this family falling apart before my eyes, it's heartbreaking. And I watch the children and the way the children are responding and the turmoil that's caused and the pain that will probably go on for generations, the way the young girl will respond to men in the future and the way that the son will question what it means to be a father and just all the implications of what happens when someone takes this path. And it's hard for me to watch. And so this is the subject that's been on my heart. It's a subject that I've been thinking about, and I thought, this is what men need to hear this morning. So this is what we're going to talk about. So I'm afraid that sometimes, in our churches, we get a little bit soft around this subject because it's sin, but we don't want to talk about it because it does happen. It is inside of our walls at different times, and it's difficult. But I don't think being soft on it and not talking about it's going to do us any good and not going to help it to go away. So when we do that, I don't want these men to fall in their lives and have this immorality, and then it's this slow moral decline that happens, and ultimately it ruins families and it ruins our communities. And so that's why we're going to talk about this. So this passage this morning is in 2 Samuel, and it has to be one of the most heart-wrenching stories in all of the Bible as I've studied through this and you see everything that goes on. You take David, who we all know David from the infamous line of a man after God's own heart. He is the man who wrote much of the Psalms and the poetry and this love that he has for God. Now remember that this is the same David that as a boy went out onto the battlefield, no armor, no protection, just a slingshot and a faith in a big God, and he declares in his little 13 or 14-year-old voice, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Right? This is the kind of honor, the kind of integrity that David carries from a young boy. This is the David that as we know, that we love, the David that has so much passion for God. In fact, you remember a year or so ago, when I spoke on Father's Day, I spoke on David as a young boy. And the fact that when he was chosen king, Samuel, in 1 Samuel 16 verse 7 says, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Okay, so at that time, David had a heart for God. This is what we know about him. we study so much about David, and we know that Jesus comes from the line of David and all of this important stuff. But yet David, as good as he was, fails in this temptation. So David has a good heart. He's a valiant warrior. He has this integrity for God, and God liked what he saw in David. David has it all, right? David has everything that he wants. God has blessed David in unbelievable ways. In fact, when you study through 2 Samuel, the first 10 chapters detail how good God was to David as we go through that. And then David and how good he was to his kingship, and he was absolutely at the top of his game when we find chapter 11, right? David was on top, and at this point in his life, he was probably somewhere in his 40s, maybe 50 years old, and this is at the point in his life when he had this fall. And you would never think, though, my point in leading up with David's background, you would never think that someone with a resume like that, at this moment, would fall to sexual immorality. And I'm here to tell you that's exactly how it works. Usually when men fall to sexual immorality, it's right when they're at the top and they think they're invincible. They're right where no one can touch them. That's the moment when they fall if they're not on guard. So this morning we're going to read 2 Samuel chapter 11 verses 1 through 5, where it says, "And it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when the kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an evening tide that David arose from off of his bed, walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child." Well, so when we were at the men's conference, at the Macaira conference that we went to a couple weeks ago, one of the pastors spoke on this very subject. And it was a powerful message and had a great framework around it. So the framework came out of a book called Disciplines of a Godly Man by an author by the name of R. Kent Hughes. So I got myself a copy of this book. It's a phenomenal book, and I've been working through it. So I'm actually going to use that same framework you see on the screen this morning to work through the message today. In this book, Kent Hughes goes over several different areas of discipline that a man should have in his life. And the very first thing that he covers after the discipline of godliness is the discipline of purity. Okay? And in this chapter, he uses David's sin with Bathsheba and breaks it out into the 5 different stages that happen during a man's fall into sexual sin. And so I've taken the liberty to borrow these 5 steps this morning, and that's what we're going to talk about, the understanding of how David ended up in this situation that he was in. So the first step that you see there is desensitization. Well, in order to become desensitized to something, it just has to become common in our lives, right? It has to become so normalized in our culture, in our lives, that it doesn't even set off the alarm bells in our head anymore. We don't even realize that whatever the subject is going to cause problems for us. And this is where desensitization comes in for David. He knew better than to be looking at Bathsheba, right? He knew better. In Deuteronomy 17, the standards for Hebrew kings was set, right? Do you remember the Israelites were begging God for a king? They said, God, we want our own king. God said, fine, I'll give you a king, but if I'm going to give you a king, he has to follow these 3 rules. And this is found in Deuteronomy 17, where God instructs the kings that they should not gather 3 things. They should not gather too many horses, wives, or gold. And so why is this? Well, God's been around. He knows that the 3 main things that Satan uses to bring good men down are pride, women, and money. Right there, the same thing it says, horses, wives, and gold. He's basically saying pride, women, and money. And that's what's going on there. And what's interesting is David did really well with this. David did well with not gathering too many horses and not worrying about gathering too much gold. He realized the important there, but he had a problem with the women, okay? In the same exact chapter that David is appointed king, we find that in 2 Samuel chapter 5, right? He's appointed king. We only get down to verse 13 after he's appointed king, and it says David took more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem. He got the power, and he took too many concubines and wives right out of the gate. And that's where the fall starts to begin, because he was desensitized. He was desensitized to the sexual misconduct that he was allowing into his life. What's interesting to note here is what David did in taking more wives. It was not illegal, though. Okay, God said don't do this, but it was not illegal in the culture and the laws at the time. A lot of the kings had many, many wives and concubines. This was a normal thing in the time. And what is completely within the cultural norm for David to do was against God's will. And so it would not have been considered adultery in the culture of the day, but nonetheless it was still sin. It was still sin before God. And that's what we need to see here. So David's sensual indulgence desensitized him to what God's holy call on his life was. And while as the danger and the consequences of falling prey to this, it ended up leading David into the most fatal sin of his entire life. But I want you to think about what I said there, and I want you to think about that and let that sink in for a minute. So things that are completely legal, things that are completely normal in our culture, God doesn't want us getting involved in some of those things. And I'm here to warn you this morning that in the legal sensuality and the culturally acceptable indulgences in our country and in our lives today, those are the things that will take us down. In today's culture, with the clickbait that's on the screens in front of us, it is unbelievable the things that you can be put before your eyes. As many of you know, Rachel and I homeschool our kids now, and I got them Chromebooks so that they could learn to type and do the things that might be involved in their education. We want to keep up and make them well educated. So I got them these simple Chromebook laptop things, and I'm setting them up this week, and I'm putting in all the parental controls, right, for this to be a kid's computer. And you go through there, and they ask you all these questions, and they ask for Dylan's age. And I put in there that he's 8 to 10 years old, right? And so I put all that in, and I'm putting in the YouTube Kids thing so they can watch kid material on YouTube at an 8 to 10-year-old range. So when I get all that done, I open YouTube Kids, the very first video, top left corner, the algorithm said the most important thing an 8 to 10-year-old needs to see is this fun, cute video explaining what non-binary is. Okay? That's the first thing they thought they needed to show them. So let's just say that I put different restrictions on the computer. So, but that's what desensitization looks like. If you can put something in front of their eyes long enough, it's normal. It's fine. It's acceptable inside of a culture. And so what they've done on these social media apps is that if you log into any social media app, it's going to take about 2 seconds until you see a half-dressed woman on there. And they show that to you all day long in front of your eyes on these platforms. It's just one small desensitization after another, to the point where it becomes normal in our lives. Another completely acceptable norm in desensitization is the expectation that men have to think that funny, dirty, coarse humor is acceptable. And oftentimes I see this at work, and you see jokes that really shouldn't be said. Jokes that should make you flush in the face, blush in the face, but guys will say them anyway. And the thing is, I don't want to make it sound like Christians should be weak, sensitive men that can't handle those things. What I'm saying is, strong Christian men should not allow those things in their minds and should not allow other men around them to fall into that depravity, because it's going to follow you, and you will be the one on the line to fall to sexual sin when you find those things humorous. And I think that's where we kind of find in this culture that David was in, that it was normal for him. It was normal for him to have women everywhere, so for him to look at Bathsheba was normal. That's where desensitization comes in. So the next thing we have, once we are desensitized, the next thing we have is relaxation. So let's reread verse 1 real quick, where it says, "And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when the kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still in Jerusalem." Well, I believe every word in the Bible is there under the inspiration of God. But what's the point of verse 1, right? The text could have just as easily started in verse 2 where it says that it came to pass in the evening that David went up on the roof and started walking around. Why do we need to be told verse 1 that he was out, that he sent the men off to battle? Well, the author felt that we needed to see something in David's character here. There was something that wasn't right about the way this situation started. And that's why verse 1 is in this story. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when the kings go forth to battle, David sent Joab. Wait a minute. David sent Joab? Doesn't it say that the kings go out to battle? So why isn't David going forth to battle? David's supposed to be the valiant king, right? Saul's killed his thousands. David's killed his tens of thousands. So, but in verse 1, we find David sends Joab, and David tarries still in Jerusalem. Meaning he's sending his men out there into the battlefield while he is quite literally hanging out in his bed back in Jerusalem. Can anybody see a problem in this story right out of the gate? Okay? He opens the door to disaster when he started to relax the disciplines that he had put into his life prior to this. His whole life he had put parameters around the things that he did to keep himself in touch with God, and then he decided to relax at this moment. Now listen, I know in a culture we are busy. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't take time off. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take time to relax. Rest is good for us. I think we work too hard. I think we do too much. But what I'm trying to say here is I get a sense that this was slothfulness, though. This wasn't healthy rest. This was David getting lazy in his life, right? And I think at this time of David's relaxation extended well beyond the physical body. I think he had entered into his moral life as well. And this is where David becomes vulnerable. We all know David's a great man, and I guarantee that this morning in particular, when David woke up, and this fateful day, I don't believe he woke up and went outside and said, I think today I'm going to commit adultery. I think today, before the holy God that I love, I'm going to commit adultery and ruin my time on the throne. I don't believe that he said that, but it happened anyway. It's in those moments when you let your inner integrity down just for a minute that temptation will come in, right? So I found a joke that I'm going to share with you. It says a guy named Danny had his mom come to visit him at college, and Danny had just moved in with a girl named Allison. And he was trying to explain that his mother, before she came over, he says, so listen, Mom, I don't want you to get too stressed out. I'm living with this girl, but it's a completely platonic relationship. We are just roommates living in separate rooms because it's cheaper to live this way, Bidenomics, right? And so his mom is a little bit questioning about this, as mothers would be. And she wasn't sure about the full reason why this girl was living there, so she comes over for dinner, and they're eating dinner, and the mother notices that Allison just happens to be a beautiful young woman. And so she's sitting there eating dinner, and she notices Allison has this watch on, and she says, I always wanted a watch like that. I think, could I borrow that watch and wear it for a little bit? Allison says, well, sure, you could try it on. So she takes the watch, and they have dinner, and sure enough, Mom goes home, and the next day, Allison's looking around, and she says, man, I can't find that watch anywhere. Your mom was the last one that had it on, and maybe she slipped it in her purse. Maybe she forgot to take it off. Would you mind reaching out to your mom and seeing if she knows where this watch is? And so Danny says, well, sure. He grabs his phone out. He texts his mother, and he says, Dear Mom, obviously I'm not saying that you took the watch, but the fact remains that the watch is missing, and you were the last one who had it. He waits for a few minutes, and his dear mother replies, Dear Danny, obviously I'm not saying you're sleeping with Allison, but the fact remains, if she was sleeping in her own bed, she would have found the watch on her pillow right where I left it. So this is what relaxation looks like, right? We try to act like it's normal, act like there's nothing going on. My mom's laughing over here. She knows. You can't get things past the mother, right? But so anyway, that's what happens when we get relaxed. That's what happens when the relaxation occurs. So the next step that we're looking at in David's decline is fixation, right? Fixation, you follow me into verse 2 and 3, it says, and it came to pass in the evening tide that David arose from off of his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, And one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Okay, so let's recap what just happened in those verses, right? David gets out of bed, walks out on the rooftop, which, that wouldn't have been completely unusual for David at that time. If you look at a layout of Jerusalem, David's palace and the temple would have been, some of the highest properties in Jerusalem. I'm sure he had a great view to look over the city, so that wasn't really out of the ordinary to do something like that. And I don't think that the fixation occurs when he just, breezes his eyes past and catches a woman bathing. Probably also not totally unusual. They don't have indoor plumbing, so she's got to be out with a bowl and some rags and stuff bathing. Totally not out of the question, but when David catches that glimpse of her, his eyes stop, right? And at that point, he starts to stare. And at that point, he gets the fixation. The appropriate action, obviously at that moment, would have been to stop looking and to go back into the castle, back into his house. But he doesn't. He stands there looking long enough to observe, as the Bible tells us, she is very beautiful to look upon. So looking at this woman from a distance, David can tell that she's got a very beautiful appearance, just completely objectively looking at her. And so this fixation then begins in David's mind. And he says to himself, I have to have that girl there. And David is obviously interested enough that he says to his servants, he says, who is this woman out there? Who is that woman out there? And one of his servants, who obviously is a wise servant, says to David, isn't that Bathsheba? But notice he doesn't say, isn't that Bathsheba, and stops. He says, isn't that Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now that comment right there should have stopped David. It should have snapped him out of that fixation that he had. But the problem is, once you hit that fixation stage, you can't listen to that rational talk around you. So when his servant said, isn't this the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? These are two men that David knows, right? These aren't just some random men out in the town. These are men that David knows, to the fact that when you look, these men had given their allegiance to David. These men are out on the battlefield for David right now. In fact, these are such great warriors in David's army that David listed them later in this book in 2 Samuel chapter 23. These men are listed as some of David's mighty men, right? So when David hears that this is someone he knows, daughter, this is someone he knows, wife, he should have stopped. But the fixation had taken over him. And unfortunately, that is exactly how it happens in our culture. That is exactly how it happens in our lives today. Sometime in today's world, affairs, which is a softer, culturally acceptable word to say adultery. That's what it is. You're not having an affair, you're having adultery, call it what it is. They start by getting too involved with people that we know, right? It's often not strangers, it's people that we know, people in our workplaces, things like that. You see, David wandered a little too long on the rooftop, right? That's where his fixation began, and that's where we have to be careful. Seemingly innocent things will catch us off guard. It could be something as simple in today's culture as giving a coworker of the opposite sex a ride home from work, and all of a sudden the conversation goes maybe a little too personal. That's you hanging out on the rooftop too long, okay? Or it could be, running into an old acquaintance from years ago and starting up a text message thread back and forth and talking about the good old days. That is you hanging out on the rooftop too long, okay? It could be looking at pictures on the internet, and all of a sudden you find yourself leading into looking at porn videos, and all of a sudden you find yourself looking at a coworker the wrong way that's wearing the wrong clothing. That is you hanging out on the rooftop way too long, okay? The greatest battle of David's life wasn't against Goliath. The greatest battle of David's life wasn't running from King Saul out in the desert. The greatest battle of David's life came as a result of not controlling his eyes. As William Shakespeare said, the eyes are the window to the soul. Job chapter 31 starts with the verse, I have made a covenant with my eyes that I would not look lustfully at a woman. Right? That's the kind of man that Job was. That's what we're looking for. David himself in Psalm 119:37 says, turn my eyes away from beholding vanity. Well, when you look up the Hebrew word for vanity, there is a whole list of negative things that vanity includes that will bring into your life, and that's what David does here. David knows that looking on something the wrong way can lead to moral failure. But he hung out too long on the rooftop, and that's where the fixation was. So the next step that we find here, the fourth step in unraveling David, was rationalization, right? So once David's eyes have been fixed on Bathsheba, his servants could not dissuade him. He's locked in, he wants her, he's going to take her. At this point in David's mind, he's all in Bathsheba or nothing. And in J. Allen Peterson's book, The Myth of Greener Grass, he says that David's rationalization could have went something like this. He could have said, Uriah's a great soldier, but he's probably not that good of a husband, right? He's probably not that good of a lover, and he's going to be away for a long time. So this girl, she just needs a little comfort from someone like me, someone like the king, right? And this is the way that I can help her, and no one's going to get hurt. No one's going to get hurt by this little decision that I make. And I don't mean anything wrong by it. It's not lust, it's love, nothing wrong. And it's not the same thing as finding a prostitute out on the street, right? This is just a young lady. God knows that. God knows what I'm up to. And that's what rationalization looks like. But all that stuff sounds crazy to us. But we end up with that fateful moment in verse 4 where it says, "And David sent messengers and took her and came in unto him, and he lay with her." At that point, it's over. So David can't control himself. And so I want you to notice the word "took" there. And he takes her as if she's just a possession to be had. And he takes her into his palace, and he sleeps with her. And she's a married woman. And I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, but like I said, I left a lot of notes out of this subject. But I wanted to catch this point, that something I think needs to be addressed. In preparing for this message, I noticed that several commentators would act as if some of the blame for this should have been on Bathsheba, right? Saying things like, well, she shouldn't have been bathing out in the open, and if she wasn't trying to get David's attention, he wouldn't have fallen for her, and there's just these different details. It's probably Bathsheba, right? Well, that's the interpretation that they have, but the problem is, the Bible is very clear that David is in a vastly superior position over Bathsheba, right? And personally, believing that God, as far back as Adam, placed men in a position to rule, regardless of Bathsheba's action or inaction, this is completely on David, right? David should have got his act together, period, okay? I have 3 words highlighted in my Bible. There's a word in verse 2, a word in verse 3, and a word in verse 4. And those words are, he saw, he sent, he took. This is David's problem. Do you realize this whole story, Bathsheba's name is used one time. If they hadn't used it one time, we wouldn't even know who she was. The rest of the story, she is just called the woman, right? As if the emphasis is supposed to be on David and the actions that David took. In our culture, we often try to blame women for one thing or another thing. Men, get your act together. So there is so much here that I don't have time to get into all of it, but what I noticed was in chapter 12, many of you that know this story, Nathan comes, who is the prophet from God. So he's giving God's account, essentially, of this situation. And what story does he tell? He confronts David about this sin, and the story that Nathan tells is one of a soft, gentle, mild little lamb, right? That's the words he used to describe Bathsheba. She's a soft, gentle, mild little lamb. Okay? I noticed that Nathan, when I read through this whole book, I noticed that Nathan doesn't say that this was a promiscuous, wild little lamb that wouldn't stay in the pasture. That's not anywhere in there. Bathsheba was minding her own business, and David took advantage of her. And we need to know that. So what does this mean for us, right? So if we're going to study this, what does it mean for us? Now, granted, I'll be the first to mention that and go on record to say that I think that more modesty in clothing choices in our culture might be a good thing. But men, at the end of the day, you are just rationalizing. If you get intimately involved with a woman who is not your wife, and your excuse is that she dressed the wrong way, or that she shouldn't have acted the way that she did, or she shouldn't have put her hand on your shoulder the way she did at the water cooler, right? Or she shouldn't have said the jokes that she was saying. Those are rationalizations, okay? Those are excuses. Don't let that flood of oxytocin ruin the life that you have created with your beautiful bride. Put your energy in at home and love your wife well in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the children and the grandchildren that are watching you for an example. Maybe your marriage is getting dull and it seems like, man, there's more excitement elsewhere though, right? These women are more exciting than my wife. Well, I have to tell you, men, there are women sitting in counselors' offices all over this country trying to get their husbands to talk to them. And men, put your phones down, put your work schedule down, set aside time to spend with your wife as God intended it, and you will have no reason to look anywhere else. Your wife is a gift from God, pure and simple. Do not begin to rationalize that you deserve something from across the street or across the town or across the country. Those are lies from a self-indulgent culture, and they have to stop with us. And that leads us to the final step this morning of degeneration. As we watch David, right, as we watch him cascade through these steps of desensitization and relaxation, fixation, rationalization, that sets him up for what I feel is one of the greatest falls in all of human history, and that is David's degeneration. Because as this story continues on, it gets worse, okay? So in verse 5, we find it says, "And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child." Okay? Now, the emotional roller coaster that David had to have felt between verse 5 and verse 6 cannot be overlooked. The Bible just says she's with child, and then it goes on and says David sent to Joab. I'm going to tell you, there was some emotions between verse 5 and verse 6, right? David's heart jumped up into his throat. His blood pressure shot through the roof. He said, what on earth am I going to do to cover up this sin? Because David's a noble man. David's the king. David has too much riding on this decision. He has to try to cover it up. And up to this point, he's the model of perfection. He's got favor from God. He's the king. He's got an amazing army. He's well respected among Jerusalem. Everything is going well for him. And then Bathsheba hands him a note. Says, hey, I'm pregnant. Okay? Everything he knows is about to collapse. And if he can find a way to cover it up, he can secretly get himself out of this mess that he's made. And that's the way that degeneration begins. When you have a major sin like this and you try to cover it up, you're setting yourself up for failure. And I don't have time to get into the whole rest of the story, so I'm going to kind of give you a quick version of it. I told the kids I was going to have to speak like an auctioneer to get through all of this. But so David sends Uriah, Uriah the Hittite, to be taken off the battlefield, and he's come up with this ingenious plan that if he can get Uriah to come home and sleep with his wife, Bathsheba, then everyone in the town's going to believe that hey, they just had a kid together, no problem. And so he believes that, but the only problem in David's plan, because remember, his mind is clouded now because of the fixation and the degeneration that he's found himself in, David's high moral code that he used to ascribe to is the very reason that Uriah won't sleep with his own wife. Okay? David doesn't allow his men to sleep with their wives. They're not allowed to have sex with their wives in wartime. And so I got into this, studying through this, and if you remember, this is actually used to David's advantage in 1 Samuel chapter 21. If you remember a few months ago when I spoke on the Sabbath and the whole thing about the Sabbath, the example that Jesus used for the justification of why his disciples were allowed to walk through the wheat field. Remember, they were picking the wheat and they were eating it, and the religious leaders were saying, you can't do that, that's breaking the Sabbath rules. And Jesus said what? Jesus used David's own example there, where he said, David and his men, while they were on the run from Saul, came into the priest Ahimelech and asked for something to eat, and Ahimelech's first question was what? Whether or not these men were clean, right? According to the Levitical code, Leviticus chapter 15, which states that if they had had sex during the prior day, they were unclean, and they were unable to eat the showbread. Well, what's amazing about this example is that Uriah, who is often referred to as Uriah the Hittite, right? So he's not even an Israelite. he knows the law better than David. He says, I can't sleep with my wife. We're in wartime. I can't do that. And so David, then he gets frustrated, and David says, okay, fine. If I can't get him to sleep with his wife, I can get him drunk. And I bet you if he's drunk, he'll go home and he'll sleep with his wife. And so he tries that, and he does that, and David gets really frustrated because Uriah still does not comply. Uriah stays away, and at this point in the story, it's crazy because Uriah is a better man drunk than David is sober. You know, Uriah is holding to the letter of the law. And so by now, at this point in the story, David is really frustrated. And so he sends a letter with Uriah to the battlefield to be handed over to Joab, the commander. And in this letter that Uriah is carrying, it's his own death notification. That he says he hands this to Joab, and David says, I want you to put Uriah into the front lines where the most intense fighting is, and then when the fight gets really hot and heavy, I want you to pull the other guys back. And that way Uriah is killed, right? And that way it'll be dealt with, and when Uriah is killed, that's exactly what happens. David takes Bathsheba as his wife, and the cover-up's complete, right? The story's good, David won, everything's over. But the problem is, the story's not over. Up to this point in the story, it would look like David has covered his tracks. But the thing is, men, you can do whatever you want in private. You can come up with the most crafted plans of where you were, or why you weren't home one time, or why you had to stay late at the office, or whatever you can craft. But I want you to know someone knows what's going on. I want you to read the last sentence in the chapter, verse 27, the very end, the last sentence in that verse. It says, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And then the very first part of chapter 12, verse 1, it says, and the Lord sent Nathan unto David. Listen, men, there are consequences to dishonoring the marriage vows that you spoke. And David is about to get a reckoning because he has displeased the Lord. And the Lord says, I'm sending someone to straighten this out. Okay? And as the story goes on, it goes from one of David in the first part of the book being an amazing, powerful leader on the top of his game. And by the end of the story, this is what David's life looks like. The baby dies. David's beautiful daughter Tamar is raped by her half-brother Amnon. Amnon is murdered by Tamar's full brother Absalom. Absalom came to so hate David for his moral depravity that he had led a rebellion under the tutelage of Bathsheba's resentful grandfather Ahithophel. Okay? David's reign lost the smile of God. His reign never regained its former stability after his sin with Bathsheba. And I don't have time to get into the statistics, but I plan to put all these different things in here. But statistically speaking, there are things going on inside of this church today and inside of families in this church at this moment that are bordering right up next to what David did. Okay? If you find yourself in that position this morning, please don't think that you can handle this on your own. The steps that we've laid out here this morning, do you see how quickly we proceed from one process to the next? Once you get caught up in this, there's no turning back. And I wish we had time to kind of get into all these things, but David begs God for forgiveness. And because God is a faithful God, he forgives David. And yes, there are still consequences to be paid. And if you're in this situation in your life, there may be consequences. There's going to be some pain. There's going to be some things that may occur, but there can also be forgiveness. What is amazing is, I really wish we had more time to kind of get into the whole thing here, but David repents, and he writes Psalm chapter 51 as a response to what he did with Bathsheba. Throughout this time in David's life, as you continue to study this story out, he is running from God when he's in this situation, but at the same time, God is running towards David. God is there. He's waiting for David to get his bearings back, and God is right there. If you find yourself in this situation, you have not sinned too far. You have not gone too far to be outside of God's presence. You have not gone too far that you can't be forgiven, but you have to stop and repent of your sin and ask God for forgiveness and bring back that unity that you had with God prior to the decisions that you've made. As you look at the wickedness of this world and this subject matter, this is not something to play around with. There is no easy way out of this. Maybe you're at a point in your life this morning where you're standing on the rooftop like David, right? You haven't done anything wrong yet, but you're just starting to look out at the horizon, okay? I promise you, if you are contemplating doing something against your wife or your children or your grandchildren or the legacy of the man that you are, it is time for you to head back in. Don't take another look. Get off the rooftop. Henry Cloud, who is a author of business books that I enjoy reading, they integrate into the church well, but in the book titled Necessary Endings, he says, "Today may be the enemy of your tomorrow. The tomorrow that you envision may never come to pass if you don't end some things today." That is a very powerful statement. The things that you do today in your personal life, if you sin against your wife, against God, you sin against those things, they may very well destroy your tomorrow and the future that you thought you would have. So if there are things in your life that need to end today, end them today. Do not wait for tomorrow. Do not find yourself in the situation that my friend found himself in. My honest prayer is that if you're here this morning and you say, "Eric, I don't have a problem with this stuff," that's awesome. That is amazing. Don't rest on your laurels because you could be a moment away from a bad decision. And secondly, I would say pray for the men around you. Pray for the men in your family. Pray for the men in your work situations. Because I can guarantee you when you look at the life around us, I guarantee you that some of these men are right on the cusp of falling. They're right on the cusp of thinking that what this other woman offers is more than what they have at home. And they come to find out, ironically, that when men do this, they find out that the same old guy that they are in their marriage at home, they're the same old guy with the girl over there. Okay? Don't let yourself get caught in that trap. If David knew the true cost of what his sin with Bathsheba would be, he would have never given her a second look. He would have went back in. And man, I don't know what your emotions are. I don't know what you do during your work week, during your week when you're not here in the house of God. But if you are anywhere on this path, I promise you, you cannot afford it. Deal with that today before God. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you for this message, Lord. It's a hard one. It's a difficult one as we look at our culture and we look at the things and we look at men's honor and the things that they do to try to cover things up and mistakes they've made, Lord, and all the things that are involved in this discussion, Lord. But I just pray that you would overlook each family here this morning, and I just pray that you would guide each husband, Lord, that you would give him strength and you give him honor and presence in his home, that he would lead his wife well and that he would lead his family well, Lord, and that he would not get caught up like David in this thing. And I just pray that you would bless each